Welcome back to your next week of Web Design 1. In this week's lectures, we're going to break up the code activities with the theoretical concepts that you learn throughout the slides. So before you start looking through these slides, make sure you have downloaded the activity2 selecting and styling.zip from Blackboard. Now, the first thing we want to understand is the div, the universal parent element. This is the most common general container box that you will see in any web page. So if you right-click and go View Page Source on any website and view the code, you'll probably see a lot of divs in there, especially in older websites, as this was the only way to contain content in the past. We have a couple of different ways that we'll look at later weeks in the semester, but for now, we just want to talk about what a div is. So div stands for division, and we wrap it around content to sort of make a container box around that. And you can put anything inside a div. So up until this point, we've been using container boxes that are specific. So things like the image tag can only contain an image, the paragraph tag can only contain text, the heading tags should only contain text that you want to be headings and bold, that sort of thing. But the div container can actually have anything you want inside of it. It's just there to hold groups of content. However, the div container can also have nothing inside of it. So it can contain anything or nothing. And we'll take a look at that in the next code activity video to see how we can actually build shapes in CSS with divs. So if you want to pause this video lecture here and jump into the first activity video, watch through that, we'll be building some divs in our HTML. So whether you want to watch this video all the way through and then jump into the little code activities, or whether you want to go through this and then pause and do a code activity video, is entirely up to you. But I've structured it in this way so that you can break up some of the theoretical and technical components. So let's talk about what HTML actually is. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's all the structural stuff that we use to tell a web browser like Firefox, Chrome, Safari what specific content we actually want it to display on our page. So that's like images, paragraphs, videos. It's all about the structural stuff. It doesn't deal really with anything like color or typography or layout, as we've seen throughout these code activities that we've done in week 1. So HTML is just the skeleton, really, that holds the content of your website. There are some default stylings on the HTML, but we can get rid of those. So as I've said quite often, think about it like an opening and closing sandwich. We create these boxes with opening and closing tags, and up until this point we've done that with paragraphs and headings and that sort of thing. But with divs, we now really create that box content. So we now have a sandwich with a bunch of different pieces of content inside of it. So divs are really useful in that way. However, there are a few tags that you'll notice do not have a partner, so they don't have a closing tag. The most common ones that you'll run into are the meta tag, the image tag, and the links tag, and they're called self-enclosed tags. You probably won't run into any other tags that do this, except for perhaps the break tag, the BR tag, that allows you to break a line of content to add space, but it's not that useful. So, as I said, HTML has a visual state by default. So what that means is there is actually a little bit of CSS on your HTML before you've written anything. This is just the way that the HTML behaves naturally before we override it or change any of these set styles with our own CSS. So default CSS is things like blue underlined links when we use the A tag, for example, and we can take that off by setting the font family. Instead of having Times New Roman, we might set it to Arial. We can go text decoration none, to get rid of the underline, and we can change the color to black so it's no longer blue. So this is the general concept of overriding the default visual state with some CSS rules. So what's CSS? Well, that's Cascading Style Sheet, and like the name suggests, it reads the language from top to bottom, a little bit like a waterfall. It's all the visual, pretty aesthetic stuff of a website. So it's how things look, all the color, the typography, layout, styling, effects, and even animation. There are even some basic user-triggered things which we'll look at later in this unit, but generally it's just about aesthetics. CSS is very powerful, but it is all the aesthetic design. So it's the interior design of the house, not the house itself. Without HTML to perform on, the CSS is meaningless. So that's why we have to spend some time to really understand HTML structure and elements before we jump too deep into CSS layout. So think of CSS as a chef. It transforms the HTML with its simple syntax, and it uses things called selectors to point at what content in the HTML we want to change. So for example, when we target paragraphs to turn them red, we target the P tag. This selector that we currently have on screen, so P, color red, this is known as a general selector because it selects all paragraphs, not one specific paragraph in your page. So the CSS selects the ingredients in your HTML page. But what if we only want one specific paragraph or one specific word, or even a combination of different elements to have the same rule or have different rules? Well, then we use things called specific selectors, and there's a lot of different ways to specifically, for example, select one letter in a paragraph or one paragraph out of 50, and so on. So here's the next place that if you want to pause this video here and move on to the second code tutorial where we'll look at combination selectors and the parent-child selector elements. So the next way to specifically select a piece of content is to use a class or an ID. So this is kind of like giving an element a special name, and we only do this if we need a really specific piece of content to be changed. So class is one way to name a specific element for targeting, and it's best to use class. It's very good for creating a set of general rules that you can apply multiple times to your page. The other way is to use an ID. Now, IDs need to be unique per page, and this will become more clear in the code activity after this. So when using an ID, make sure there's a good reason for using it. So just like a class, it's also a way to name an element, give it a special name, but we do have to come up with a new ID name every time we use ID in the page. So IDs are useful. They have this special ability that classes don't have, where they can be targeted by anchor tags. And this is really good for when we make a one-page scrolling website. We actually make our navigation target sections in our page by using IDs, so that's why they're very useful. But generally, I would stick to classes for naming things. They're best for unique rules as they override classes with the same rules. So if you have a class and an ID and they have a conflicting rule, so they have, let's say, font size, one says font size 30, the other says font size 50, the ID is going to win out over the class. So this might sound a little bit confusing, like they're almost the same thing, and they kind of are. The easiest way to remember this is, as a student, you can have multiple classes at university, but you can only have one unique student ID. It's sort of the same case for HTML, where you must have a unique ID per page, so it has to have a unique name. But for a class, you can have that class repeated as many times as you want in the page. So if you want to use a rule multiple times, pick class, a special one-off, use ID. As I said, it's most efficient to stick to class unless you have a reason not to at this point. So here again, you may want to pause the video and work through the class and ID video lecture so that you understand how classes and IDs work. Make sure you open up this validator here so that you can test and see just how strange IDs can get if we have multiple ones per page. The next thing we might want to do is add a little bit of visual interest to our page. At this point, we've only used web-safe fonts, and it's unlikely that those are the ones you'll want to use in your final assignments when you're uploading your content to the web as a final website. We can add custom fonts via using a server to host them, so Google Fonts is a great one to use, but there are others out there like Font Squirrel, but for now, Google Fonts is the one that we'll experiment with. But we can also download any font face that is free for us to access, or if you purchase it and have the license to it, you can download that font file and keep it inside a folder the same way that we have images and videos inside folders. We can do that with fonts as well. And we can use the @fontface_css command to point at the direction of where that font lives in our folder structure and load it into our page. So this would be the next point where either pause this video or keep watching, but follow along with the code tutorial that talks about font faces, and make sure you've opened up Google Fonts and dafont.com, as we'll be working with those two websites to look at how to add a font from a server and a custom font. So after that, we probably want to start adding a little bit of space to our page. Now remember last week we talked very briefly about the box model and how margin and padding somehow come into that. Well, now we're actually going to look at what that means and how to use margin and padding. So margin creates space around the outside of an element, and padding creates space inside the element, so it kind of puffs it up. It might help you to think of margin as pushing objects away from yourself. If you're standing in a room and you have a greater margin from another person, it's like pushing the distance between the two of you further. But padding might be like adding more jackets on top of yourself. So let's say you put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 jackets on. You kind of puff up. You take up more space. That's really the difference between those there. Now border is the lines around the element. That one's pretty straightforward to understand. And then we have these things called text align. Now text align is a little bit tricky in that text align can align text, but it can also align child elements by targeting the parent element, so placing text align on the parent element. So now we'll take a look at what that even means and test how text align center works and this thing called margin zero auto. These are two different ways to center chunks of content. So again, either pause the video here to work through the next code activity looking at margins and paddings, and then the final code activity looking at text align center and margin zero auto.